Fear response confirmed. Images of the haunted house are effective. Serotonin and dopamine levels are optimal.
The first time a Xylosian psychologist watched a human scream at a blank wall for 90 minutes, then laugh about it, she filed a formal request for psychiatric intervention. The second time, she requested military containment. By the third time, she stopped making requests and started drinking something fermented, which was, she later learned, the most human response she could have possibly had. You have to understand, to the rest of the galaxy, fear is not a pastime. Fear is the chemical herald of extinction. When a Vritha's chromatophores blanch white, it means a predator is seconds away. When a coral's electromagnetic sense spikes with static, it means the ground beneath it is about to crack open. Fear is a countdown. Fear is the body's last, desperate message before the dark. So when the humans arrived on the galactic scene, smiling, shaking hands, offering something called diplomacy, nobody knew what to make of the creature that willingly walked into terror and called it fun. The Andromeda Compact had been collecting species for 11,000 cycles. 63 sentient races, each cataloged, studied, and assigned a threat index. The Xylosians handled psychology. The Vrith handled military assessment. The coral handled environmental adaptation. It was a tidy system, a living library of survival strategies, and nothing in the library had prepared them for Homo sapiens. Ambassador Kthar Vex of the Xylosian Conclave still remembered the day the humans arrived. She had been reviewing the preliminary reports from the first contact team: standard fare, bipedal locomotion, opposable thumbs, tool use, tribal history. Nothing remarkable. Their homeworld was a death trap by compact standards. Gravity too high, atmosphere too corrosive, radiation levels that would have triggered sterilization protocols on any half-sensible planet. And yet they had thrived. Not just survived, thrived. Spread to every corner of their globe, built cities, split the atom, looked up at their stars, and said, "We're coming." Threat index, she had asked her assistant, a young Xylosian named Trell. Pending, Trell had said, his sensory tendrils twitching with uncertainty. But preliminary assessments suggest minimal. Their technology is crude. Their social cohesion is fractured. They still wage war against themselves. And their biology, he had hesitated. There's something odd about their fear responses. Kthar had looked up from her data slate. Odd how? Trell had played her a recording. It was grainy, pulled from human entertainment archives, something they called cinema. The footage showed a group of humans sitting in a dark room, staring at an illuminated screen. On the screen, a figure in a white mask stalked through a house with a knife. The humans in the audience were screaming. Some were clutching each other. Some had their hands over their eyes. Their heart rates, according to the biometric data Trell had somehow acquired, were spiking to dangerous levels. Cortisol flooding their systems. Adrenaline dumping into their blood. Every measurable marker of acute terror. And then the scene ended and the humans laughed. They turned to each other, grinning, chattering excitedly about what they had just seen. One of them said, "That was amazing," and meant it. Kthar had watched the recording 3 times. Then she had closed her data slate very carefully and said, "Request a cultural attaché. I want to speak with one of them directly." That conversation happened 3 standard months later in a neutral zone station orbiting a dead star. The human they sent was a woman named Dr. Elena Mendoza. She was small by human standards. Kthar would later learn that humans called her petite, and that this was considered an observational fact rather than a medical diagnosis. She had dark hair pulled back from her face, calm eyes, and the kind of steady, unhurried posture that Kthar had learned to associate with predators who had already decided you weren't a threat. Ambassador Kthar, Dr. Mendoza said, extending her hand in that strange human greeting ritual, "Thank you for meeting with me." Kthar had studied the gesture beforehand. She extended her own upper manipulator, not quite a hand, but close enough, and allowed the human to grip it briefly. The contact was warmer than she had expected. Human body temperature ran high, another consequence of that death trap world. "Dr. Mendoza," Kthar said, "I appreciate your willingness to speak with me. I have questions about your species that our databases cannot answer. Ask away. Thar activated her recording device. Your entertainment. The horror movies, as you call them. Why do you consume them? Dr. Mendoza smiled. It was not a challenging smile, not aggressive. It was the smile of someone who had been asked this question before and was genuinely happy to answer it. Which part are you confused about? The fact that we watch them, or the fact that we enjoy them? The fact that you enjoy them, Thar said carefully. Our understanding of fear is that it is an aversive state. An organism experiences fear, it takes action to remove itself from the fear stimulus, and it avoids similar stimuli in the future. That is the foundation of survival learning across 63 sentient species. What you're describing is a direct inversion of that principle. You seek out fear. You pay for it. You celebrate it. This is not merely unusual. This is, from a biological perspective, incomprehensible. Dr. Mendoza nodded slowly, as if Thar had just made an excellent point in a debate. Okay, let me try to explain. Have you ever been on a roller coaster? I don't know that term. The human paused, thinking, it's a machine. It takes you up very high, very fast, and then drops you. Your stomach lurches. Your heart races. You feel like you might die for a few seconds. And then it's over, and you feel alive. More alive than you did before. Thar felt her sensory tendrils flatten against her skull. You build machines to simulate near-death experiences. Yes, and you pay for this. Absolutely. And then you do it again. Sometimes we wait in line for an hour just to do it again. Thar was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Dr. Mendoza, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Does your species have a cultural history of self-destructive behavior? Mass rituals involving bloodletting? Psychotropic substances that induce psychotic breaks? I'm not asking to judge. I am asking because I need to understand whether this is an aberration or a norm. Dr. Mendoza laughed. It was a warm sound, human and disarming, and it made Thar's mandibles twitch in confusion. Ambassador, we have all of those things. But that's not what this is. Horror isn't about wanting to die. It's about wanting to feel the edge between living and dying and realizing you're still on the right side of it. It's a reminder that you're alive. That is not a survival instinct, Thar said. That is a malfunction. Maybe, Dr. Mendoza said. Or maybe it's the reason we're still here. Thar had ended the meeting shortly after. She had filed her report, 3,000 standard words, meticulously documented, concluding with a recommendation for further observation, threat index pending. She had expected the compact to dismiss the human anomaly as a cultural quirk, interesting but irrelevant. Instead, the report triggered something she had not anticipated: curiosity. The Vrith wanted to study human combat footage. The Coral wanted to study human survival stories. The other 59 species, each in their own way, wanted to know what kind of creature sought out fear and called it fun. And then 6 months later, the compact stopped being curious and started being afraid. The crisis came from the Grell, a species the compact had encountered 3,000 cycles ago, and wisely decided not to antagonize. The Grell were not malevolent in the way most species understood malevolence. They simply did not register other life forms as significant. To the Grell, a sentient species was no different from a mineral deposit or a gas giant, a resource to be extracted, an obstacle to be removed. They had no malice because malice required acknowledgement, and the Grell acknowledged nothing beyond their own expansion. When the Grell Scout ships entered compact space, the Council did what it had always done: calculated probabilities, assessed military capabilities, and prepared for a long, grinding war of attrition. The Grell had superior firepower. The compact had superior numbers. The math was grim, but not hopeless. And then the Grell did something unexpected. They landed on a human colony world. Not a strategic target, not a military outpost, just a farming settlement on the edge of human space. A place called Harrow's Reach with a population of 12,000 and no defensive capabilities to speak of. The Grell landed, extracted the colony's water, and mineral resources, and left. The humans, those who survived, were found 3 days later by a compact patrol ship, wandering the ruins, covered in dust and blood, and something the rescue teams initially mistook for battle damage. It was grief. Raw, open, unshielded grief. Human grief, Kthar would later learn, was a force of its own. The compact's military assessment had been clear. The Grell could not be stopped with conventional warfare. Their energy shielding was too advanced, their weapons too precise. The best the compact could hope for was containment, pushing the Grell back to their own space and holding the line until the Grell lost interest and turned their attention elsewhere. It was not victory. It was not even survival, not really. It was endurance, and the compact had been enduring for 11,000 cycles. The humans had been members of the compact for less than one. And yet, when Kthar was assigned to coordinate with the human delegation on military strategy, she found something she had never seen in 63 species. Absolute, unshakable, almost religious refusal to accept the math. "We're not going to contain them," said General Marcus Webb, the human military attaché. He was a large man by human standards, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from old wood. "We're going to kill them." Kthar had studied human military history. She knew about their wars, their genocides, their atrocities. She also knew about their resistance movements, their impossible victories, their stubborn refusal to die when the math said they should. But knowing something intellectually and seeing it in person were two different things. "General Webb," she said carefully, "the Grell's energy shielding is rated for sustained bombardment from capital-class weaponry. Your species does not possess capital-class weaponry. Your species does not possess anything that can meaningfully threaten a Grell warship. The math is not on your side." General Webb looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, the color of ice, and there was something in them that made Kthar's sensory tendrils curl tight against her skull. "Ambassador," he said, "do you know what a horror movie is?" Kthar felt a chill run through her. Not a physical chill, Xylosians didn't experience temperature that way, but something analogous. A warning signal, a flicker of fear in her own hindbrain. "Yes," she said, "I am familiar with the concept." "Good," General Webb said. "Then you understand that we've been training for this our entire existence. Every nightmare we've ever put on a screen, every monster we've ever imagined in the dark, every story we've ever told ourselves about the thing that wants to eat us." He leaned forward. "The Grell think they're the monster, but they've made a mistake. They hurt us, and now we get to show them what happens to the monsters in human stories." Kthar did not understand what he meant. Not then. Not until the footage started coming in. The human response to Harrow's reach was not what the compact had expected. There were no declarations of war, no strategic repositioning, no diplomatic ultimatums. Instead, the humans did something the compact had never seen any species do. They stopped being afraid. Not just stopped being afraid. They weaponized the absence of fear. The first Grell ship fell 3 weeks after Harrow's reach. A human boarding party, volunteers, every single one of them. And Kthar would later learn that the humans had received 12,000 applications for the mission, breached the hull of a Grell destroyer using a method that the compact's engineers initially dismissed as impossible. They had not used advanced technology. They had used a converted mining shuttle, a jury-rigged electromagnetic lamp, and a human being in a pressure suit with a plasma torch. That human being, a woman named Private First Class Mira Chun, had cut her way through the hull while the Grell's automated defenses fired at her. Her suit was breached 3 times. She lost 2 fingers. She was, by every measurable metric, experiencing catastrophic fear responses. And she kept going. When the compact psychologists reviewed her biometric data after the mission, they found something that made them revise their entire understanding of human neurology. Private Chin's fear responses had not been suppressed. They had been acknowledged and overridden. She had felt every spike of terror, every flood of cortisol, every screaming instinct to flee. And she had said no. The compact psychologists called an emergency session. They presented their findings. Humans could experience fear, recognize it, and choose to act against it. Not because they were immune, not because they were braver than other species, because they had been practicing horror movies, haunted houses, roller coasters. Every deliberate exposure to fear, every voluntary descent into terror was a training exercise. Humans were not born with the ability to override their survival instincts. They learned it. They practiced it until it became second nature, until their brains could process fear as information rather than command. And then they went to war. The second Grell ship fell a week later. The third fell after that. Human tactics were not brilliant by compact standards. They were not elegant. They were, in fact, horrifying. Humans threw themselves at Grell defenses with a disregard for personal safety that the Compact's military theorists had no category for. They used themselves as bait. They used themselves as shields. They used themselves as currency, spending their own lives to buy inches of ground, seconds of time, fragments of advantage. But they did not waste those lives. Every human who fell bought something. Every sacrifice created an opening. Every time the Grell killed a human, they learned that the space that human had been occupying was now occupied by 5 more. The Grell, for the first time in their recorded history, hesitated. Ambassador Kthar watched the war from a command station orbiting a neutral planet. She watched the humans adapt, improvise, overcome. She watched them laugh in the face of certain death, not because they were stupid, but because laughter was another form of fear management, another tool in the box. She watched them tell each other jokes before boarding actions. She watched them sing songs during orbital bombardments. She watched them hold each other, physical contact, skin to skin, the strangest human ritual of all, and draw strength from the touch. And she watched the Grell learn to be afraid. She remembered, in those long months, a conversation she had had with Dr. Mendoza, back before the war, when horror movies had seemed like a curious cultural artifact rather than a battle manual. Fear is just information, Dr. Mendoza had said. That's all it is. Your heart races. Your palms sweat. Your brain tells you to run. But you don't have to listen. You can hear the warning and say thank you for the update. Now watch this. Kthar had not understood. Now, watching human soldiers storm a Grell dreadnought with nothing but magnetic boots and plasma rifles, she understood perfectly. The Grell withdrew from compact space after 11 months. They did not surrender. The Grell did not have a concept of surrender. They simply calculated that the resource expenditure required to continue the war exceeded the value of the territory they sought to acquire. They left. They did not return. The Compact declared victory. The celebrations lasted for 3 standard weeks. And, in the quiet after the celebrations, the Compact's council gathered to assess what had just happened. The humans had lost 47,000 people at Harrow's Reach. They had lost 300,000 more over the course of the war. In terms of raw numbers, their casualties were higher than any other Compact species. And yet, when the council asked the human delegation what they required for reconstruction, General Webb, the same man who had looked at Kthar with ice blue eyes and said we're going to kill them, simply said, "Send us your horror movies." The council stared at him. "Your horror movies," General Webb repeated. "Your scary stories. Your monster myths. Everything you've ever been afraid of. Send them to us. We'll adapt them. We'll make them scarier. And the next time something comes out of the dark to hurt us, we'll be ready." The council granted the request. It seemed like a small thing. It was not a small thing. 5 years after the Grell War, Ambassador Kthar Vex received an invitation to a human cultural event. The invitation was beautifully crafted, printed on something the humans called paper, a material so fragile and temporary that Kthar initially assumed it was a joke. But the words were sincere. The annual Harrow's Reach Horror Festival requests the honor of your presence. Fear not, or do. That's the point. She went. Of course she went. She had spent 5 years studying humans, and every year she learned something new, something that made her previous understanding feel like the scribbles of a child. The horror festival was held on the site of the destroyed colony, now rebuilt into something the humans called a theme park. There were rides that dropped from great heights. Mazes filled with actors dressed as monsters. Screens showing films of unspeakable terror. And everywhere, the humans were laughing. Dr. Mendoza met her at the entrance. The human looked older now. 5 years was not a long time by compact standards, but humans aged visibly, their bodies marking the passage of time like trees growing rings. Her dark hair was streaked with gray. Her eyes were the same. "Ambassador," she said, smiling. "Welcome to the festival." "Dr. Mendoza," Thar replied. "I have to admit, I still do not understand this." "No," Dr. Mendoza said. "But you want to. That's why you're here." They walked through the festival together. Thar watched humans scream, laugh, clutch each other, and buy overpriced food from vendors. She watched children, human children, small and loud and seemingly indestructible, run through a haunted house shrieking with delight. She watched a young couple hold hands during a film about a murderous entity that could not be killed, only delayed. And she watched with growing unease as a group of human veterans approached the memorial at the center of the festival. The memorial was a simple stone obelisk, listing the names of the 47,000 who had died at Harrow's Reach. The veterans stood before it in silence. Some of them cried. Some of them saluted. Some of them just stood there, breathing, present, alive. "Do you see?" Dr. Mendoza asked quietly. Thar considered the question. "I see a species that embraces fear rather than fleeing from it. I have seen this. I have documented this. What I do not see is why." Dr. Mendoza was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "We're all going to die, Ambassador. Every one of us. That's the fundamental truth of human existence. We know it from the moment we're old enough to understand the concept. And that knowledge, it breaks some people. It makes them small. It makes them hide. But some of us," she gestured at the festival around her, "some of us decide that if we're going to die anyway, we might as well dance with the thing that kills us. We might as well look it in the eye and say, 'I see you. I know you're coming.' But not yet. Not today." Thar felt that chill again, the one that wasn't a chill, the one that was her own ancient survival instincts waking up and paying attention. "You are not describing courage," Thar said slowly. "You are describing defiance." Dr. Mendoza's smile widened. "Same thing, different word." "No," Thar said. "Courage is facing fear despite yourself. Defiance is facing fear because of yourself. Because you refuse to let fear win. Because you have decided, consciously and deliberately, that fear will not dictate your choices." She looked around at the laughing, screaming, terrified humans. "You have turned fear into a choice. And that means you are never afraid of the wrong thing. Only the things you choose to fear." Dr. Mendoza tilted her head. "That's actually a really good way of putting it." Thar felt something shift in her understanding. The humans were not fearless. They were not brave in the way other species were brave, overcoming terror through discipline or desperation. They had done something far stranger. They had befriended their fear. They had turned it into entertainment, into art, into a tool. They had looked at the thing that was supposed to keep them alive and said, "You work for me now." And that, Thar realized, was the most terrifying thing she had ever encountered. Because a species that could control its own fear could control anything. Without the automatic handbrake of terror, without the instinctive flinch from danger, there is nothing they would not do, nothing they would not try, nothing they would not survive. The Grell had learned this. The Compact was learning it now. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, other species were watching, calculating, wondering if they wanted to test the humans. Thar hoped they were smart enough not to. The festival continued into the night. Thar stayed longer than she had intended, watching the humans celebrate their survival, their grief, their strange and beautiful relationship with terror. She watched them hold each other. She watched them laugh until they cried. She watched them scream at shadows, and then thank the shadows for screaming back. Before she left, Dr. Mendoza took her aside. The human's face was serious now, the smile gone. "Ambassador," she said, "the council is going to ask you for a final threat assessment. I know this, and I want you to be honest with them. Thar nodded slowly. I will. Good. Dr. Mendoza met her eyes. Just remember, the thing that scares us most isn't the monsters. It's not the dark. It's not death. She paused. It's the idea that we might face those things and realize we were never really alive to begin with. That's why we watch the movies. That's why we build the haunted houses. That's why we dance with fear. Because when you dance with fear, you know you're still standing. You know you're still fighting. You know you're still human. Thar had no response to that. She simply inclined her head, a human gesture she had adopted without realizing it, and walked back to her shuttle. On the journey home, she composed her final threat assessment. It read, in its entirety, the humans are not the most dangerous species in the galaxy because of their weapons. They're not the most dangerous because of their tactics. They're the most dangerous because they have looked into the face of absolute terror and said again. They have taken the thing that makes all other species run and turned it into a game. They have reprogrammed their own brains to enjoy the thing that is supposed to kill them. Do not underestimate this. Do not think it is a quirk or a curiosity. It is the single most terrifying adaptation I have ever witnessed. The humans are not afraid of us. We should be very, very afraid of them. She filed the report. She waited for the council's response. It came 3 days later. Threat index revised to maximum. Observation protocole upgraded to permanent surveillance. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Do not, under any circumstances, make them afraid. They enjoy that. Thar read the response and thought of Dr. Mendoza standing in the ruins of Harrow's Reach, smiling at the darkness. And for the first time in her long life, Ambassador Thar Vex understood what it meant to be truly, deeply, existentially afraid. Not of the humans, for the humans. And for whatever poor species would be stupid enough to make them angry next.